I probably just ought to say thank you, Frank, and let's move on to the first concurrent session. Thank you, Frank. Those of you who've had a chance to get to work with Frank knows apparently he spins some tall tales, I guess, what that means. It was a privilege, of course, to work with Frank, as it has been for, I don't know, I think maybe I had the good fortune of working with maybe 56 students, dissertations. And Frank was among the best. And he did get a lot of feedback. Yeah, that's how we get better. I mean, that's one of the pedagogical practices that we underuse, in part because doing it well is time consuming. But nothing is more important. None of us gets better at what we're trying to do unless we do get feedback. I'm delighted to be here, part of this great American experiment called CUNY, right? We're still trying to get it right, but what a terrific legacy it's had over the decades, and what we do in this system never been more important for what we're trying to accomplish with our students. So, have you heard about the completion agenda? Anybody know what that phrase means? Paul, I didn't put this slide up for you necessarily, but that's an inside joke. Paul, the provost here, will tell you about rats in New York and how he catches them. Anyway, so we want students to finish what they start, whatever it is, a certificate, AA degree, aspirations for going on and so forth and so on. But if students finish and they earn something like that, it's really a hollow achievement for them and for us if they don't leave changed in some very important ways and with the skills, proficiencies, dispositions that will enable them to survive and thrive, not just through their educational program, but after they leave. That's what your work is about. Your work is about taking students to levels that they themselves perhaps have never imagined. I mean, that's not just what we're trying to do at LaGuardia, but there's such terrific work going on here that's trying to be modeled elsewhere around the country. So no matter what frame of reference we use or what place in the institution we come from, and having this conference organized around learning inside and outside the classroom is one of those too infrequent opportunities to bring the so-called two sides of the house, right? The aisle, whatever. You know what I mean, academic and student affairs. And we've been beating this drum about how important it is to find ways not just to collaborate, but to reduce the kinds of runaround situations that lots of students experience at our institutions. And that's true no matter what type of place you come from. So it is about not just raising students' aspirations, but actually raising their level of attainment and achievement. So I'm at a point in life where I'm getting rid of stuff. Most of you are too young to be worried about that. You're still acquiring stuff. I'm getting rid of stuff. And some of the things I'm getting rid of are a lot of complicated ways of thinking about our work. And so I've reduced my kind of central focus in terms of my writing and the work I do to thinking about the primary tasks that all of us need to be engaged in. And they're simple, they're terms that you use all the time, and I want you to be thinking about those in the next 45 minutes, but also through this day and as you move back into your home campuses. The unnatural act of thinking about our own thinking in ways that enable us to see different patterns around us in the world, to take what we're learning from one class, from one work experience, from one activity in the church, and see relationships. And then those relationships, we talk about synthesizing and such. Those relationships between these experiences and knowledge, they make us different in some ways. But what makes our work the universities and colleges in this country, distinctive mostly to the rest of the world, is we actually expect students to do something with what they're learning. We actually expect them to apply, transfer, and so forth. So it's reflect, integrate, apply. And if we, for me anyway, as I think about my own work and my contacts with students like Frank and others, in what ways am I providing opportunities? And I'll be stronger than that. And of course, what we know out of Achieving the Dream and lots of other student success stories is expecting students to do things is important, but requiring them to do the things we know work is probably more important, especially when we have a rationale and some data to support it. So I want to spend the next, what do I got, 2.5 hours? It's me and then lunch. I can't remember how this is organized, but just a few words, kind of centering words, bringing us all kind of back to the same place. So, you know, what is we're trying to do with our students and why? What is the world now expecting of our graduates, our certificate holders? And then I can't go anywhere. You know, I'm kind of a one-trick pony these days. I always have to talk about engagement, and then now we've tacked on this phrase, high impact practices, and there's plenty of discussion in CUNY and elsewhere about those things. And since I get to leave at 5 o'clock, I go back, I have 5 recommendations for you. And it's up to you to figure out what to do with them. Straightforward things that I think will make sense to you. So this is the nature of our world today. And by the way, when you read these through these bullets, you can believe them because they come from the federal government. This is the Department of Labor, Bureau of Labor Statistics, speaking the truth always. But what if this is true? And these numbers may be off a little bit, but what if it is the case, which most people agree, that we now have about 1/3 of the people who are working in this country changing jobs every year, right? Changing jobs every year, and 30 million people doing something in the workplace. The nature of that work didn't exist the year before. What kind of educational background prepares people for this kind of churning, dynamic environment? You know, how many of you are in the career planning work out there, career services and so forth and so on? Yeah, they're hiding. They don't. This is what happens when I ask for audience participation. Back in the day, many of you can recall this. We were told, you're going to have to do 4 or 5 different things in the course of your life. 4 or 5, and now they're saying 10 to 14 different jobs by mid-career. Mid-career. Now, Frank mentioned the Strategic Arts Alumni Project, and it's been a blessing in my own professional career, but one of the things about people who have come out of arts backgrounds and whose bliss is to do art in some form, they're the canary in the mine. These people have been showing us the way forward for decades. These are people who are working multiple jobs at the same time. They're short-term jobs. Most of them, at one point or another, run their own business, even though they never anticipated doing so. And more of our students are finding their way into, not the arts, but in every field, really, very similar kinds of work settings. What kind of curriculum prepares people for this kind of world? I read the New York Times too, but we get it a day later in Indiana, so it's not really the news, But the Wall Street Journal, pick up your favorite rag, the Chronicle of Higher Insight, and then you got a group of people who are saying, too many people going to college. There are too many going. What is that about? In a world that demands more and more and more every day from us in terms of critical thinking and complex reasoning and so forth. And of course, employers, depends who you talk with on a given day, but they do want more. They're like academic deans, when they meet with the provost, What do you want? More. I want more. I want more money. I want more resources. So, but employers are by and large, you can't read this, I'm sure, but all this chart says, coming out of the work at AAC&U, is that employers do want more. I think this has been true of every generation. As the stakes increase, as the demands on the workforce increase, we want people who have more intellectual capacity, right? We want people who can think more critically and communicate effectively in real time. More. There's no surprise to us there. So what kind of preparation is the world now demanding of our students? So you got somebody like Tony Carnevale at the Georgetown Center. You've probably bumped into his stuff and maybe not recognized where it's come from. And this is a center that chews up all kinds of data about who today is doing what kind of work, how much they get paid. I hear too much about that in some ways. But more importantly, what kinds of educational background have they had? And the nature of our world is there aren't very many unequivocal conclusions you can draw about the human experience. But one of those out of this data set is that Carnevale says, in terms of making your way post-college, it doesn't make any difference where you went. And it really doesn't make any difference what you actually majored in. What makes a difference is whether you leave with what he calls this broad set of cross-cutting capacities. And when you begin to unpack those, they begin to sound like the usual suspects. Critical thinking, analytical reasoning, effective communication. Whatever the major is, if you can't do those things and others, not the least of which is to interact in meaningful, effective ways with the other, wherever the other is, in real time, asynchronously, across race, gender, especially social, political, and economic quartiles, you can know a lot of stuff, but if you can't put it to use effectively. So what kind of educational experience brings us to that point? This is again AAC&U. Frank mentioned the LEAP initiative. There's a lot of folks in the room here who have been touched by it and are contributing to it, that campaign to make sure liberal education outcomes are valued, the very things I've just briefly mentioned. I'm not going to go through these. The usual suspects, as I say, are up here, but I want to spend just a moment on this last bullet, this capacity for deep integrative learning. It begins to look a fair amount like the capacity to reflect, integrate, and apply. Nobody has, that I know of, an objective test of whether someone has the capacity for deep integrative learning. But if you look at what people have been writing and saying, not just in the last, but for decades, these are some of the features of a person who is developing, in another way of saying it, the ability for lifelong learning. That person who's one of those 30 million people who's going to be in a job next year that doesn't exist today. Right? Learning in real time, and so figuring out not just what the source of information says, but how it can be used, how it fits into what I already know, putting these ideas together, being able to take what I'm learning and apply it in a vastly different context than when I first encountered it, right? And of course, at no other time, this has been building for centuries, at no other time has it been more important in order to be effective with peoples from different backgrounds and to not just appreciate that there may be differences, but to, I guess, the kind of literal walk a mile in their shoes, right? Even if you don't agree with their point of view, coming to know it and imagine what it would be like to hold it is a very interesting mental gymnastic that is not easily acquired, that ability. So how does one organize the undergraduate experience so that this miracle this miracle occurs. And that concludes my... Well, there's a lot of stuff that speaking of stuff, Howard, that's what we were talking about earlier. A lot of technical stuff that goes on. Of course, a lot of what really matters to getting in and perhaps doing well course-wise in college happens a long time prior to their arrival. We're not going to, if we had more time, we could talk about that. It's very complicated, you know it well, and socioeconomic background and educational opportunity and da-da-da-da-da. But once they arrive, once they show up in some form, there are certain characteristics of their experience that at least statistically begin to predict whether they're going to get out of wherever they start or move to other places and finish, right? And so we know about some of these things, and not to short shrift any of them, finding a place that matters, where there are other people like me, that affinity groups, what we know coming out of lots of different places, but the CESI research, the Community College Survey of Student Engagement, is that peers, this has long been known about other kinds of outcomes, but that peers are the single most important source that others look to. And when people are thinking about leaving, it is usually a member of that affinity group that says, no, 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 we're here doing this together. That's why you create learning communities, right? It's a funny thing about learning communities. Students who are in them, broadly defined, spend on average 20% more hours a week preparing for class, often in the company of other students, which creates this, as you know, this creates this kind of social, I'll call it social, it's what it is, it's a social bond. They now know people, and they can rely on people, and they work with people. You know about the stuff about credit hours, getting those 18 credits in the first year, that catapults your way towards success, or drop, if you don't, you decline by about a third, you're going to finish school, and all of these things we do inside and outside the classroom. A moment about goal realization, a term that I think maybe my research team made it up, I don't know, but it comes from several different strands in the student success persistence literature, and it represents something like this: the ability of a student to tell you in their own words why they are here and what they are getting out of the experience. Why they're here and what they're getting out of the experience. And there's a measure of relevance, transfer, and application here that we cannot overlook. And I want to come back to this point and maybe flesh it out a little bit more, because I have a sense that most of you don't know what the hell I just said, and I'm not sure I do either. But it is, at least for example, one course in which a student is enrolled where there is something happening in or related to that course that they can actually use and see relevance to their life in the current moment. As contrasted with students, surely you hear from them, who don't know why they're in this introduction to psychology or social work, or name a course, a survey course that seems at this moment in time to have no application to their life. And there are ways I think we can, I'm going to say trick, but that's not the right word. There are ways that we can bend the pedagogy, and you're doing it now. We had good conversations. You know more about this. The electronic portfolio is a vehicle to bring students into spaces, often in the company of their peers, where they are in their own way making connections, right? Making connections from what they're looking to, studying, and their life outside of class. I'm going to come back to goal realization. These are things that if students experience them early, we get a hook in them, and we're more likely to find ways to help them survive and thrive. Well, I didn't mention this last one because it's all about engagement. What else can I say? And I'm having trouble fast forwarding. What have I lost here at the bottom? Where are my techie friends? You've left me. I can't seem to, what is this thing on the bottom? Is this supposed to roll? I can't seem to forward the slide. Good thing you didn't leave town. Okay, don't go too far. Thank you. So this is our good friends, Ernie Pascarella, Pat Terenzini, the Pizza Brothers, as I like to call them, who twice in their professional careers have reviewed and synthesized the very best research on our business, the outcomes that are desired for college graduates, right? And how many of you, by the way, have read this book? The whole book. You know, my tagline here is that not even, the reason this book is co-authored is that not even Ernie and Pat have read the whole book. Because it's a major tome, as you know. But they come away with several, but not very many, unequivocal conclusions, one of which is, of course, getting students to expend more time and energy in the things that we know matter to their learning, right? Of course, individual effort, as they say, is important, but what is really important for our work is finding ways to, as they say, shape, design, connect, help students experience the kinds of activity, involved in the kinds of activities that we know will matter. We've come to call this, over the last 15 years, student engagement. It's had other labels over the years. You know, involvement in learning was a major report when some of you were still in diapers, and on and on and on it goes. But what we also know, and one of the reasons that we should celebrate a meeting, a coming together like this, is it's not just what goes on in the classroom. You know, students spend 70, 80%, of their waking hours not in class. They're doing something else on and off the classroom, right? So it's not just a village anymore. It's not just a campus anymore. What you have here is a huge laboratory for learning and personal development, right? And so how do we use these resources toward the ends that are desirable? It's a pretty simple algorithm, really. We often forget it, and certainly the people who write for the New York Times don't seem to get it. And that is, it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is what you do. So controlling for anything we can statistically, it turns out that the people who get more out of what we offer are those who spend more time and effort doing the things that matter. What students do. Simple thing, you can join a health club, but if you don't go and work out, you end up looking like me. Right? So you can come to class, but or more importantly, if we don't use the pedagogical practices that are not just tried and true, but some coming online, the kind of active collaborative learning that we know is this artful science we're learning more and more about, that's how we get students to do things they might not on their own participate in. And we've learned some things over these last decades about places that seem to have figured out how to do this work well, where students are more engaged than you'd predict given their backgrounds, and where higher percentages of students finish what they start, again, relative to what they looked like when they arrived, right? And we know what this stuff looks like. Been around a long, long time. I'm not going through this list. I've already talked about feedback, of course, being maybe one of the most powerful levers we have. Frank mentioned student-faculty interaction, but each of these, and there are many others, this is a widely distributed list, but each of these, including student-faculty and staff contact, has a little twist to it. It's not, and Frank emphasized this, it's not just being together. It is the nature and substance of what transpires during that interaction. So this is not about talking about the Mets always. They're around here, aren't they, the Mets? Okay. Of course, some natural conversation, ease, and so on. But it's the conversations that push students to what? Think about their thinking and how what they're experiencing is connected to something else going on in their life. Inviting, asking, giving students an opportunity to practice reflection and integration. And at the end of the day, I mean, if you leave with nothing else in your mind's eye from this, it is, where are we requiring students to practice these kinds of so-called unnatural human acts and show us that they can actually do it? And of course, where do students get practice in working effectively with other people? Well, these are the ideas that drove the origins of NESE and SESI, and most of you in the room have used SESI, I guess. You know, this NADA survey about sex, drugs, rock and roll is too bad. We'd get more attention if it was, right? But we do base it on, and it's, for many institutions, it's the first and sometimes only kind of large-scale window they have into the nature of the student experience, which is important because, as we rehearse here, it's not who students are, it's what they do, and that's what these simple tools measure. Not everything that matters is measured by SESI, right? But a lot of important stuff is, and its best use is as a diagnostic tool because it doesn't tell you near enough about the nature of the student experience, but we do know some things. We know these are presidential scholars at LaGuardia, that's what we know. Oh no, we know this stuff, that's what we knew this, we've known this probably for hundreds of years, but SESI and NESE, a lot of other related work showing the same pattern. The more engaged, the more students read, the more they write, the more feedback that they give, the more they interact with their peers, working on scripted problems that faculty and staff design, the more they are applying their learning to unscripted problems in their lives outside the classroom. More experiences they have in the contacts, substantive contacts with the others who are very different than them. I mean, you people who work in service learning and, study away, community engagement, some of the most powerful transactions are among peers outside of the formal classroom when they get stuck with people that they don't want to be with, which begins to sound a lot like the workplace. Think about that. How do we learn to work effectively? Parker Palmer, some of you know him, he's a Quaker philosopher, and I guess Quaker and theology don't go together, but anyway, he once said, what it's like to live in a Quaker community is living next door to the person you least want to live next door to. And that's a lot of how we spend much of our life, especially in the work. I mean, not in CUNY. I don't mean in CUNY. I mean people who don't have the luxury of working with all of us, right? Anyway, so engagement is positively related to all sorts of good stuff on average. Students are more engaged, they're more satisfied. Satisfaction, is not our primary reason for being, but of course, if students aren't satisfied, they're less likely to stay. And the longer they stay, the more they get the good stuff. But like everything else in our world, it's more complicated. I'm going to spare you a lot of the details, though you can buy my books if you like. It turns out that a lot of the things that we have on the books, drawing board, things we do, learning communities, first-year seminars, and so on and so forth, will have maybe slightly different effects on students. Some students benefit, in other words, some students benefit more than others. I'm not going to go into the details. We call those conditional effects. What has been very, if not surprising, rewarding, more and more so-called data, studies showing compensatory effects of certain kinds of practices. Now, if we were in a small, intimate setting, I'd say to you, well, let's pretend we are. So if a person compensates for something, what are they doing? They do, no. Okay, just say what the person next to you whispered. That way you don't have to take. If we compensate for something, what are we doing? We're filling. Well, that's good. We're finding a way to, well, fill in the gap means to get something that we don't have. We often will use the phrase, right, overcompensate, meaning we can't do that, so we're going to do more of this. Compensatory effects. Hold on to that one thought, and then we come to this phrase, high impact practices, that we've discovered that when students do certain things, when all students do them, as it turns out, background characteristics notwithstanding, they seem to benefit in unusually positive ways. So, some of you have seen these. This was the original monograph, High Impact Practices, 2008. Makes a wonderful bedside setting reading. I will tell you, and you should not repeat this outside this room, that we actually bumped into high impact practices, not by mistake, but you know, we're like you applied behavioral scientists. Sometimes you really don't know what you're looking for until you find it. And so we went looking, churning up a number of questions on NESI that we didn't know much about, except people thought they were cool things to do, like study abroad. Everybody, it's a life-changing experience, people who study abroad. Well, is it really? Because there's not that much research, frankly, on study abroad. A lot of anecdote. And what about this thing we call the first-year seminar? And what about student-faculty research? I mean, that's a deeply held fundamental truism that students who work with faculty on research benefit in extraordinary ways. Well, we had a list of those things, right? SESI has a list of those things. And it turns out that they actually do benefit students in extraordinary ways. There have been other things that have been written in the AAC&U kind of line of high impact work. And if you haven't seen this one, this was out in last December. The work that Ashley Finley and Tia McNair and others at AAC&U have done across multiple states and dozens of campuses, that the impact of participating in these things that I haven't mentioned yet as a high impact practice have unusually powerful effects on the people who most need, typically, the compensatory bump, and that is students who come from low income backgrounds, students who are less well prepared academically, often students who are in the numerical minority with regard to race and ethnicity. I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. So this is, you're probably sick of seeing this list, but it's the only one I got, so I'm showing it to you. This is the, as I now have come to call it, this is the officially approved list of high impact practices. Make no mistake, the officially approved list, and I should come back to that point later, because surely there are other things that have extraordinarily powerful effects on students when they do them. But you let your eyes run through such a list, and you can, most of you will conclude that your campus institution is in really good shape because, Professor Koo, we do all these things. We do all these things, and therefore move on. And so I'd ask you just to ponder 2 or 3 more points about. Oh, by the way, if we spent a fair amount of time talking about this list, we'd find maybe that we don't entirely agree on what the particular bullet represents. For example, this is not a first orientation to college. This first-year seminar referring. This is not an orientation to college class. This is a discipline-based course that has academic expectations tied to it. But when it's wrapped around a first-year experience, there is a lot of psychosocial stuff that goes on in this class too. And this is one reason why some of these that work best have a peer mentor or preceptor Undergrad just begins to sound like a sop, right, for the stuff that the people at LaGuardia are doing. I mean, they tried to convert me yesterday, but I'm holding fast, trying to be still a little circumspect about it. But you're probably all doing something like that, right? Where you've got a relatively small seminar, which has a decent amount of welcome to support. This is how we get our business done at this place, kinds of activities in it, and hopefully a number of the other effective educational practices, including feedback and so forth and so on. Does everybody get to do one of those? Does everybody get in a learning community at where you work, you know, the 2 or 3 block scheduled classes? You know, who, simply put, at your institution, who gets to do one or more of these? And do you know? And not the most important, but another key aspect is, it turns out, those of you who, for example, are in service learning work or you coordinate service learning work, it turns out that when you talk to people individually who coordinate these kinds of classes, they will admit, reluctantly perhaps, that some service learning courses are better than others. So I'm picking on service learning. It could be any one of these. It could be student-faculty research. We know, for example, that if all a student does in that experience is help a faculty or staff member collect data, they do not benefit nearly as much as if they participate in the entire inquiry cycle. I think I have a slide later. I'm spending too much time here rather than showing that. Implementation quality, the bane of our existence. Some of these things, they all work. They all work. But some of them work better than others because of how well they're implemented. So remember that notion of deep integrative learning, nobody has a measure of it, blah, 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 blah. Well, we think that the more practice students get at some of the features that we think characterize the capacity for deep integrative learning. So the more we ask students, we design assignments that ask students to bring in information from different courses. Think about your own program now. And you might think about it, you know, if you're a classroom instructor, lab, studio, you might think about this in the context of your own course. How many assignments does a student have, let's say in the course of a program, where they are explicitly required to bring in material from multiple courses and demonstrate how they are making meaning and can apply that information? Where is it happening? Where do students show us that they can take, that's a highfalutin word, theories, let's just say take the content and the proficiencies that are being gained in a particular course or program and apply them, right, in different situations. And sometimes this means off the campus, often. It doesn't have to, but it could mean that. You can go through each of these. The point is that we think the more time and practice students get doing these things, the deeper their capacity will be for making these kinds of connections, right? And so now hold on to your chairs and seats, folks, because this is where we really start rolling. This is where the data slides start coming in, and this is what gooses us all up. This is why we're here, right? This is why we're here. Yeah, you laugh. So, here's our measure of deep learning, and what that represents is a summation of how students respond to these kinds of questions. It's simple, very often, sometimes, and what do students know anyway? Anyway, so this is a measure of deep learning. It's a number. It's 23, 27, whatever it is. The higher the number, the more experienced students are getting in a given academic year with this. And let's just take one of these. Let's take the one that I made. Service learning, right? This is the course that has an out-of-class component to it. Could be on campus, often it's off campus, where students are taking what they're learning, often in the company of peers, small groups, and seeing how it works in the so-called real world. Okay, whether it's biology, reclaiming a plot of land, or cleaning up a river, or whether it's social work or psych class. Every place here has some service learning courses. If you have been in a service learning course in your first year of college, that's flipped off here. Here it is. First year, if you've had a service learning course, you are, and this is a statistical phrase, you are way more likely to report engaging in deep learning kinds of activities. Now, statistically significant difference. How many of us are applied behavioral social scientists and we get goosebumps when we say we have found a statistically significant difference? Yes. And you know, and you people, some of you know this, that the more people you have in a study, there are 4.5 million students in the NESI database, and the larger the number of people you have in an analysis, the easier it is to get a statistically significant finding. Which means that when we run an analysis at NESI on anything, it's always statistically significant. So we can publish anything, even if it doesn't make any sense, because it's statistically significant. I mean, you know, Frank, if I'd have discovered this 25 years ago, I'd have 700 publications. Anyway, we know these things, but I want to say about these findings, the thing that caught our eye immediately and continues, these patterns are annual patterns as we look at the nature of the experiences of students who do one or more of these things. These pluses, everything on this is statistically significant, but the more important point is that these pluses represent the magnitude of the difference between those who do and those who don't. Now, you're getting tired of my spending so much time on this, but these are called effect sizes, and when you see 2 or 3 pluses, you are now, as we say, kind of bordering on the whole standard deviation difference between those who do and those who don't. This is really, really unusual in this kind of work. And that's why when we ran this, I said, that can't be right. We ran it. Well, we ran it, and they keep coming up this way, and they keep coming up this way for all of these things, right? And this is a different slide. It's because the students who are in these, who do these things, who've been in a learning community just in the first year, although some continue further, but this is just if you've done, it's not that you've done all of these, it's that you've done one of these. You're more engaged across the board. You report, as I mentioned earlier, if you're in a learning community, you end up, on average, the students who do this, 20% more time a week, we would say, on task. What in the world is that about? I think it's about a peer effect, but we can talk about that later. You spend more time giving class, you have more experiences giving class presentations. You're more likely to work on problems outside of class. You're more likely to talk with your teachers and others about substantive matters. And you're more likely to see the campus environment as being supportive of your academic and social needs. I mean, this pattern is, well, it's overwhelmingly positive. Are you with me? Is people of CUNY, are you with me here? Yes. Yes. Well, now that you're with me, I'm not going to go through all this stuff, but and as we tease, I mentioned implementation quality a little bit ago, and as we dive deeper and look more closely at the characteristics of each of these high impact practices, we find that some are better. Everybody benefits, and that's the extraordinary thing. No matter how well they're delivered, everybody is benefiting in a positive way, but those learning communities that have more of these features, the gains, the engagement indicators are stronger for students who've been in these. And of course, these are the kinds of learning communities that take a little more time and attention to set up and to sustain, right? So I'm not going to, and part of this is because we've got instructors who are kind of cross-fertilizing the other going in both directions in terms of designing assignments. I can't emphasize how important we are discovering these. I guess I'm a slow learner, you've known this. But the nature of assignments is really where the so-called learning hits the road. That's where we demand students exhibit the kinds of proficiencies we say our course, our program, our college is intended to cultivate. Where else would they show it? Right? And the same thing is true of student faculty research. I'm moving on here because I haven't gotten to my 5 points yet, have I? No, I haven't. Any one of these high-impact practices, not the practice itself, but the features, can be replicated in any classroom, lab, or studio. These are the things that make high-impact practices high-impact. Right, where the expectations are set, we somehow design assignments and other activities where students are spending more time than they think. These are places where students, as I mentioned earlier, are spending time with the people they less like to spend time with, and they got to learn how to do that. And that's helpful if we are giving them feedback along the way, and we design in multiple opportunities for them to think and to show us that they're making connections across these matters. And remember when I said goal realization now 35, 40 minutes ago? Where do students discover the relevance to their lives of what they're learning in your class, your lab, your studio? How do we design, how do we get them, portfolios is one way, how do we get them to be thinking about the transfer, seeing application, and then of course it all comes down to, can they show us they can actually do this publicly? I don't know if you can see this, but this is a student pilot who aced all the written material, and then when it came time to show me. So I've hinted at this. There are surely lots of other things that go on at your institution that resemble the kinds of experiences students get when they are in one of the approved high-impact practices. Now, as I've been telling some other people, everywhere I go, people come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, Professor Koo, my class is a high-impact practice." Turns out everybody does a high-impact practice. Maybe you do. I bet you don't. So we need better data. There are other things. In the heyday of NESE, when the New York Times actually published stuff about NESE, Washington Post and other places, the reporters, would say, their trick question was, what's the single most important thing a college should make a student do, right? And so I had answers on occasion, but I began to turn the question around. And I said, well, I'll give you my answer, but tell me, what was the single most important thing you did when you were in college? These are reporters, national, regional, local. What do you think they said? The single most important thing they did in college was, we're running out of time. I'll give you a hint. Writing for the student newspaper, the Stanford Cardinal, the Harvard Crimson. They were writing for the poetry magazine. They were working on stories. And a lot of those stories never were read by anybody because the daily editor said they weren't good enough. Think about the nature of feedback you get if there are lots of other roles, experiences that students have. Intercollegiate athletics, playing for a touring band or choir or in the theater. The people who are in theater work, their engagement scores go through the roof on some of these dimensions because that's where they're spending an inordinate amount of time. Yeah, that's how people clap for themselves. Oh, I bet it's a high-impact practice. I bet it's a high-impact practice. So I'm sure there are others, but you think about the nature of the feedback that the basketball players get on a basketball team, practice I'm talking about. Are they saying finish? Get off the stage? Is that what they're saying? Well, I'm not suggesting that we try to mimic this in every classroom, but you know that feedback is public. It's often, well, loud, doesn't have to be loud. It has meaningful impact in the present. If I don't improve my game, what happens to me? I either sit or my team does not perform as well as it could, right? And so we, in our own way, many of us are designing assignments that are based on very similar kinds of circumstances, right? So how well we do this stuff, and then, wow, advising implications are huge. So if I'm the czar of advising, I'm not going to suggest to a student that at some future point they explore the possibility of maybe seeking out a faculty member to do research or getting involved in a learning community. I want to say to the student, when are you going to do this? And of course, the college can help by making sure there are plenty of such opportunities available, but even better, everybody here is in a learning community. Or some of you are in a learning community and others are in a well-structured first-year seminar. Or that first-year seminar is part of the learning community. And that first-year seminar is writing or inquiry intensive, right? Everybody is going to do a capstone experience, no matter what the length of the course of study is, at LaGuardia. You got to do it because that's an effective educational practice, and the students who do it benefit more. Well, advisors, we got to figure out how to get, because the students who could most benefit from these kinds of practices are less likely to find their way into them. That's what this chart is showing. And we have plenty of evidence. This is not about any single institution in this room. It's national data. But we know why. We know nobody I'm a first-gen kid. My father was a truck driver. My mother worked in a bank at the end of her career. Both of them smart as, in their own way. But I tell you what, there was never one conversation at my dinner table about study abroad. Not one conversation about doing research with a faculty member. Hell, they didn't even know what college was, really, except I was going to do it because apparently somebody told them that I should do it. Oh, I think they were smarter than that, but you get my point. When students come and they don't know what to look for and do, we got to be more structured and more directive, I think. So, as I said, any one of us can take these kinds of characteristics, feedback, high expectations, more interaction, and infuse them in any classroom, lab, studio. Let's get out of here. Let's finish up here. So, 5 quick points that I want to make, and all of this is about what you are doing, many of you are doing, and we can all do more, being more intentional about what we ask students to do, and to insist that we just don't do what we've always done because, right, we've always done it. We need to insist first for ourselves and then for our colleagues that we draw on what works locally, but also getting some cues and clues from national research. So a lot of, the people in the Teaching Learning Center here at LaGuardia and every place else know all about this stuff, right? All about this stuff. It took some of us 30 years to get there. It took me 30 years to understand that if I spent just a few minutes at the beginning of every class bringing students back to, I thought, Frank will probably remember this, I thought that what students did between my classes was the same thing I was doing between my classes. I thought they were reading the stuff for my class. And I thought that when they woke up in the morning, they were thinking about what was going to happen in my class tomorrow, right? Well, it turns out they have other classes. They have other classes, and they work, and they have families, and they go to church, and they got to figure out where to pay for gas at the lowest. They got all sorts of other stuff going on. So bringing students back to where we left off, very important, and then kind of scaling forward what we intend to do in this next 50-minute hour, and how we're going to know where we're getting there, and this is what we expect to have happen when we're done. 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Turns out that when faculty members do something akin to that, the learning spikes. The involvement spikes, the retention of whatever the content is spikes because we've brought them back. Well, all of these things matter. And then there's all this stuff coming out of Achieving the Dream and other places that I know some of you are doing, and we're not going to go through all these things, right? But what we know is if we can't figure out how to reduce these awful DWF rates in some of these gateway courses, students expend money, time, and it lengthens their time to completion. I'm not saying wave them through, I'm saying, as many of us are doing, figuring out ways that actually work better, right? Well, I'm not going through this either because I'm running out of time. And I'm not going to talk about the DQP, even though I'm working on it. I'm getting paid to work on it. I'm getting paid to tell you about it. But it is a way of bringing into focus the kinds of proficiencies that we've decided as a community are important to college outcomes. That's another conversation, and maybe we can do it another time. So, money matters. That's why Gail and Paul are here. They're here to take names, and because you'll get more money. They know that you signed up, and don't worry about that. But it's not the amount of money that a campus has. It's where they spend it, where it gets invested. And we learned this in our student success in college. We had two kind of independent analyses of how institutions were spreading money around. And then since that time, there have been real economists coming on the scene, right, with Jane Wellman at the Delta Cost Project and Ron Ehrenberg at the Cornell Institute, and they're coming up with very similar findings. Not how much, but where, and where has a why component. Why are you putting money here? Where is the evidence? Hopefully quantitative, qualitative, systematically collected, more than anecdote. Not to say anecdote isn't important, but we better have more than anecdote, right? So Jane says, look, we should not go through a budget cycle without demonstrating, articulating why we're going to continue to do this, or why this new thing requires our support, right? That's just common sense, but too often we don't do the common sense thing. And so this is the most recent of the ACNU publications on high impact, and it's what many of you are doing here, investing on the front end and expecting a return on that investment, both in terms of student success numbers as well as increased tuition income from whatever source that tuition income. And so it's a scary thing, scary proposition on the front end, you know, taking some money and putting it here and kind of betting on the come, as they say in Las Vegas, or, well, you probably have your own casinos here too, I don't know. Investing in success, and which means, this is my polite word here, we have to stop doing some of the things we're doing now. Because we're never going to have enough. We may not have new resources. So it means that some of us are going to have to stop, not leave, but we stop doing this so that we can invest our energy in this other thing that has a much higher return on investment. Very, very difficult conversations. What if some of you are trying this? You're on the trajectory to have every first-year student do a high-impact practice. Every first-year student. California State University system, their 23 campus faculty senate is trying to figure out if they can make a required HIP as part of its Gen Ed program. That's the kind of results they're getting there. They're finding when students participate in these. And so this is, some of you may have seen this chart. This is kind of driving lots of conversation, not just one. There's other data points, but this is Cal State University Northridge. Some of you know this, a Hispanic serving institution. I don't know, 37, 38% students Hispanic there. And they did this backward analysis, and it turns out that if you've not done a high impact practice, any one of them, you know, less than 40% finish in 6 years. But if you've done one, now that number is almost half. And if you've done two within that 6-year period, that grad rate, finishing baccalaureate rate, is now 2/3. And these findings are being mirrored in other CSU campuses that have been able to do this backward chain analysis. And the same thing, I mean, you get a similar effect with other types of students in there. This payoff on the promise. And of course, employers love this stuff. I'm not going to go through this chart, but they love to know that you've actually had a long-term investment in a project and it's come to fruition. You've completed it. And if there's an analysis of it, right, someone has written up, including, may I make another point about e-portfolios? Including the reflective piece about e-portfolios that you know a student can embellish and carry with them. Last point. I bet almost everybody at your college, students, some of you faculty and staff too, also work. I don't know what percentage of students at your institution work, but I bet it's big. What if we viewed work as a potentially high-impact activity? You remember goal realization? Where students are seeing the relevance of what something, maybe not every class, but something that they are studying has an application to something concrete in their world that they are doing right now. This is a student at the information desk at the University of Iowa Campus Center, where I want to tell you I waxed eloquent 4 years ago. I was so good. I was in tears when I finished because so moved. So if you haven't written anything down yet, write down GROW, all caps, G-R-O-W, and make sure you're thinking about the University of Iowa, because they've got a fairly impressive website that they've been building for the last few years there, because they are systematically, they started small, but now every student in the division who's working, they got 2,300 students, for example, who work in food services, residence halls, some other place on that campus, and every one of them is having now multiple structured conversations with their site supervisor about things as profound as, what are you learning here in this job that you're helping or using in your classwork? Have you learned anything in class that you're using here? Now, and the funny thing happens on these first few conversations, when you ask a student what they have learned in class that they're using here in this job, you know what you get? I beg your pardon? I mean, they won't look you in the eye even when they're looking. Because no one has ever asked them that question before. That they should actually be thinking about using what they're learning somewhere in their studies on this job, and vice versa, and vice versa. And you know, after a few these kinds of conversations, students start to get it. Because in between these conversations, they've now been cued, and of course their friends are saying, what the hell was that conversation about? You know, so they're thinking, kind of, they talk like they talk when they leave class and they're befuddled. What's going on here? And Iowa has figured out how to kind of fast forward this a little bit, because you bring in then, you know, a second or third year student who's been through this kind of experience, and they're sharing a few things which is triggering in the mind's eye of students who've never thought about this. And so if you can think about reflection, integration, and application, here's another place to practice, and a place that every student can ultimately excel at. And of course, what better preparation for them when they leave your campus? The capacity developed, continuing to develop capacity to think about what's happening to them and how what they're learning here, there, and other places. So Iowa gets these are old data, and the red numbers are statistically significant. My supervisor helps me make connections. Now I wish, you know, this number were 100%. Look at this. I can now see connections between my job and coursework. Can you say goal realization? Finding relevance in what I am studying here to some I'm not saying this is the be-all, end-all, but imagine if we had more students at LaGuardia Hillsborough, other places who were having these conversations. And so now all supervisors in the Division of Student Affairs at Iowa go through the training. I'm making it sound highfalutin, but you got to have some of it, right? And even the supervisors need some support here because many of them, never thought about this being part of their work. And of course, they're really getting jazzed up about it. Well, we got to demand more from ourselves and others about why we do what we do. We've got to move some money around, probably to go to scale with more of the things that we are getting more evidence matters. That means some of us are going to have to move our own effort into something else that is likely to have a higher return on the student success investment and so forth and so on. Imagine, some of you are close to this now, right? With every first-year student being touched in some way by something that you could legitimately claim is a high-impact practice, and you can't just assert it, you got to show us some data. And what if, and we could find ways to make the off-campus work experience, and there are ways to do this. If we're teaching a class, we can bend an assignment that is asking students to apply what we're doing here to their work or other aspect of their life outside the class. So let me conclude, right? I'd like to run right to the hour here, Howard. That way I get no hard questions, no trick questions. I want to conclude, I like to conclude, I've grown accustomed to concluding with a quote from Aristotle because nobody can challenge you. Did Aristotle really say that? CUNY is a long-term, very important experiment in American higher education. And the things that we are doing now at the ground level, some of these things are really important experiments. Some of them are better funded, some of them are better designed, some of them are better implemented. But there is this point where we say, some of us to ourselves, I've been there myself, I don't know if I can do this because I've never done this before. This is not the way I did college, right? Well, we got to figure out the only way we're going to get there. John Dewey, a lot of other people have been saying the very similar thing. The only way we're going to get there is we're going to have to try it. So, what do we do? How do we design? How do we implement? Where do we require students to get practice at thinking about their own thinking, about making connections between what's happening to them in the program, in the college, between these experiences and outside of class? And where do we not just encourage, but require students to show us they can actually do it? Where is that happening? And if we wait until the end, at the capstone, we're not going to get near the quality of performance out of them as if we build it in to more individual courses, more programs, more practices. Thanks very much.
Well, I think, pardon me, I'm speechless.
I had that effect.
That really is going to get us off to a great start today. We can take let's take 5 minutes at most, and then we want to kind of move things forward. But if we can take 5 minutes for a couple of questions for George, that'd be great. Speechless, yeah. Anybody? Yes. Yes.
Tell us who you are, please.
What you said, Dr. Q, was really very interesting and really exciting. I'm concerned about the students who are online, dedicated online. The sense of talking afterwards or outside of the classroom doesn't seem to apply to the brick and mortar students. Yes, but if we've got programs that are totally online, try to develop a community community of students, of scholars, and having to think as scholars instead of thinking of, I have to go like, do this and then run and go to work. And how do you make that connection? Because I love the idea of you talking about work as a high impact practice. That's something that we've got to really digest. And maybe that's probably answering my question, looking at work.
I think that's a terrific question and a terrific answer. I couldn't agree more. Or some other, I mean, I will admit, I worry about students who are doing all of their work online also, for multiple reasons. But I'm also a realist, and for some students, it's the only way they can get it. But we ought to try a few more experiments, because I bet some of those students who are doing all their work online would not just agree to, but would benefit from meeting their peers face-to-face a couple of times in an academic term. It can be scheduled. It can be done. Do we have the will to do it? Now, short of that, if you're saying, no, these students are, some are in Japan, some are in South Africa, then we got to be a little more innovative. Now, I got people at my institution who say there are 101 ways to effectively engage students online. And so we need to go to these people who've been doing this work and see the research. I will say this, that when we did the first runs in NESE with people who were doing all of their work online relative to students who had bricks and mortar experience, at least by the crude NESE measures, the students who worked online were as or more engaged in terms of the amount of time they spent and so forth and so on than the bricks and mortar students. In large part, they're older, they're more focused. I'm really worried about the 18 or 19-year-old who does all of his or her work online for, again, different reasons. The only area, this is now 6, 7 years old, and it's just changing. The only area where students were less engaged, I'm talking about the online students, active and collaborative learning. The face-to-face interactions with peers, unscripted problems. But the technology is going to get better. I'm not recommending it as a wholesale substitute, but a large part of the impact is the nature of the learner, and we need to know more about that.
We'll take one more. Janie?
I bet they can't hear you, but this is Jamie from the Queensboro Center for Teaching and Learning.
Thank you so much for your talk, and as I'm sure you know, these very important pedagogies aligned with high-impact practices are a big challenge for many faculty who have little, if any, background in pedagogy. They're not trained in that. And I've seen, so maybe you can advise me, I haven't seen a lot of publications that focus on what should professional developers do, what do you recommend in that regard?
I recommend doing it. I'm out of my depth there, but there's more and more going on at places that you frequent, like POD, right? But you're absolutely right about this, and it's not only about so-called high-impact practices. It's about a gamut of things that have to do with technology and MOOCs and other ways of delivering what we know. That's my Aristotle slide, right? Part of it is safe places. Part of it is small groups of people come together. Part of it is incentivizing faculty to do it. And part of it is the realization that we better go where the heat is. And if we're going to try to convert everybody in a short period of time, we're not going to get much done with the people who we might have a shot at. There are a lot of long-term implications. Who are we recruiting for the next generation of faculty? Every time we talk to somebody about a job here, this is what you're going to be doing. This is where the resources are to support you. And so there's a long train of a kind of who you recruit, who you promote, who the reward system has got. There are a lot of things we can do, but we need to be realistic about how fast we can get to critical mass. I'm done. Thank you very much.